The first thing you notice is the hum. It is a low, constant vibration that rattles your teeth and settles deep in the marrow of your bones. It is the sound of the atmospheric cyclers, the ventilation fans the size of hab blocks, pushing the heavy, wet air of this planet back out and pumping recycled chemical-scented oxygen in. You learn to love that sound. You learn to sleep to it. Because if the hum stops, even for a minute, the spores get in. And if the spores get in, you drown in your own lungs. I used to press my ear against the cold plasteel of the barracks wall just to hear it clearly. It sounded like safety. It sounded like civilization. We were the masters of this world, or so we told ourselves. We were Delta 9. We were the iron boot on the neck of the jungle. The station was a fortress of gray metal and yellow hazard stripes, a monument to the Imperium's stubborn refusal to coexist with anything it didn't build. The walls rose 50 meters high, sheer cliffs of ferrocrete, topped with automated heavy bolter turrets that tracked the movement of the birds. We called them birds, but they were more like leather kites with teeth. Inside the walls, everything was regulated. The temperature was a constant dry 20 degrees. The lights were harsh sodium floods that banished the shadows. It was sterile. God, I loved how sterile it was. I have this condition, a need for clean. On a hive world, they might have called it a neurosis. Here on Xylos Prime, it was a survival trait. I kept my boots polished until I could see the fear in my own eyes reflected in the leather. My day always started with the decontamination ritual. It wasn't optional, but for me, it was a sacrament. You step into the chamber, stripping off the sweat-stained undersuit, and you wait for the hiss. The nozzles engage, and they blast you with a chemical mist that smells like bleach and burning ozone. It stings. It finds every microabrasion on your skin and sets it on fire. Most of the men grumbled about the chemical burns, about the way it made your eyes water and your throat tighten. Not me. I stood there, arms raised, letting the stinging mist scour me. It felt like purity. It felt like I was washing the planet off me layer by layer. I would scrub until my skin was raw and red, just to be sure nothing green remained. We gathered in the mess hall after the cleanse. The mood was always loud, boisterous, a wall of noise to block out the silence of the forest outside. That's where I saw Harlan. He was a good worker, operated a loading crane. He was sitting across from me, picking at a patch of skin on his forearm. It looked irritated, a patch of raised red bumps, like a rash from heat friction. He caught me staring and laughed a rough, barking sound. He said it was just the humidity that a seal on his suit had chafe-rubbed him raw. He scratched it with a dirty fingernail, and I had to look away. I felt a phantom itch crawl up my own spine. I told him to go to the Medici servitor. He just shrugged and said the servitor only cared if you were dying or missing a limb. A rash wasn't worth the paperwork. The work shift was 12 hours of violence. I was a heavy logger. My machine was a modified Sentinel Walker, stripped of armor and fitted with industrial chainsaws, massive enough to cut through a battle tank. We rolled out of the heavy gates in a convoy, the ground shaking under our metal feet. The transition was always jarring. One moment you are in the sterile yellow light of the bay. The next, the blast doors grind open, and the world turns into a wall of green. The smell hits you even through the cabin, filters a thick, cloying scent of rotting orchids and copper. It smells like a slaughterhouse disguised as a garden. We went to work on Sector 4, a patch of ironbark trees that had regrown 3 meters in a single week. My machine roared the spirit of the engine, angry and eager. I drove the saw blade into the trunk of a tree as wide as a chimera transport. The wood screamed. It didn't crack or splinter like normal wood. It shrieked a high-pitched wet sound, as if I were cutting through wet bone. Sap sprayed across my viewport, thick and crimson. We called it blood sap, I triggered the wiper, smearing the red slime across the glass, and pushed harder. The tree fell. The ground shuddered. I felt a surge of power. We were taming this place. We were turning this nightmare into resources for the Emperor's wars. I remember pausing for a moment during the midday cycle. The suns were high, filtered through the canopy into a bruised purple twilight. I checked my console displays. Spore count was at 0.4%. Acceptable limits. Green lights across the board. Outside, the jungle was moving. It always moved. Vines uncoiled like lazy snakes inching toward the heat of my engine exhaust. Flowers the size of buckets turned their heads to follow the movement of the saws. It was creepy. Yes, but it felt distant. I was behind 3 inches of reinforced glass and plasteel. I was safe in my bubble of recycled air. I revved the engine just to watch the nearby ferns recoil from the noise. It was a game of intimidation. By the end of the shift, the perimeter was a wasteland of stumps and sawdust. We had cleared 100 meters of encroachment. We felt victorious. We lined up the walkers for the return trip, the heavy hydraulic legs hissing as they settled into transport mode. I looked back at the tree line. It looked waiting, not defeated, just waiting. There was a mist rising from the broken stumps, a reddish haze that drifted low to the ground. My comms crackled. It was Harlan again, joking about a drink he had stashed in his locker. I could hear him scratching his arm over the Vox channel. The sound was like sandpaper on dry wood. I turned my volume down. Back inside, the decontamination cycle felt shorter than usual. The water pressure seemed low. I scrubbed harder, panicking slightly, digging my nails into my palms. I needed to be clean. I needed to be sure. After the shower, I went to check the atmospheric scrubbers in my HAB unit. It was something I did every evening, a personal ritual. The maintenance tech said the filters were changed yesterday. They were supposed to be pristine, white pleated paper. I unlatched the access panel and pulled the filter tray out. I stopped. I didn't breathe. The filter wasn't white. It wasn't even gray with dust. It was clogged with a thick, velvety mat of red moss. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a breathing lung. I stared at it, the metal tray trembling in my hands. This filter was new. It was behind 3 layers of purification screens. And yet, here it was. The garden was already inside. I looked at the vent cover, then at the door, then at my own hands. I felt the air in the room suddenly grow heavy, tasting of copper and sweet rot. I shoved the tray back in and slammed the latch. I washed my hands again, and again. I used scalding water until my skin blistered. I told myself it was a defective unit. I told myself the tech had made a mistake. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening for the hum of the ventilation. It was still there, but it sounded different now. It didn't sound like a machine anymore. It sounded like something was purring in the walls. Would you like me to proceed with Chapter 2? The Roots Beneath. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red moss pulsing in the air filter. It was small, insignificant, but it felt like a crack in the hull of a submarine. I needed to know. That compulsion, that sickness in my head that demands cleanliness, it drove me out of my bunk during the gamma shift. I volunteered for maintenance duty in the lower sublevels. The foreman looked at me like I was crazy. Nobody goes down to the roots of the station voluntarily. It's a punishment detail reserved for drunks and insubordinates. But he handed me the heavy wrench and the master key card without a word. He looked tired. Everyone looked tired lately. The lift ride down took 5 minutes. 5 minutes of descending into the dark, leaving the sanitized air of the barracks behind. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. The hum of the ventilation fans, my constant companion, grew distant and distorted, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of condensation. When the doors opened on sublevel 12, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of machine oil or recycled waste, which is what a basement should smell like. It smelled sweet. Sickeningly sweet. Like honey left out in the sun until it turns black, mixed with the copper tang of old plumbing. I engaged the seals on my collar, but the smell seemed to bypass the filter sticking to the back of my throat. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lumen strips that flickered with a nervous, stroboscopic rhythm. The floor was slick. At first I thought it was a burst water pipe. I walked carefully, my magnetic boots clanking heavily on the grate. I shined my torch at the puddles. The liquid wasn't water. It was viscous, amber-colored and sticky. It trailed from the ceiling, running down the walls like sweat. I followed the trail toward the main drainage junction. This was the kidney of the station, where all the waste and runoff was supposed to be processed and incinerated. The main hatch to the junction was bulged outward, the heavy steel warped, as if something had punched it from the inside. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct I had, every alarm bell in my primate brain screamed at me to run back to the lift. But I had to see. I had to know if the station was clean. I braced my boots against the floor, grating, and heaved on the manual release wheel. It groaned, a screech of tortured metal that echoed in the dark. The seal broke with a wet sucking sound, and the hatch swung open. I raised my torch. The beam didn't hit the back wall. It hit a wall of white. Roots. They were everywhere. Massive, pale, fleshy cables as thick as a man's thigh coiled around the pipes and machinery. But they weren't just growing over the metal. They were growing into it. I stepped closer, my breath fogging my faceplate. I saw the tips of the root tendrils burying themselves into the ferrocrete foundation. The concrete around them wasn't cracked. It was soft. It was gray mush. The roots were secreting some kind of enzyme, some hyperacid, that turned our impregnable fortress walls into nutrient paste. They weren't breaking in. They were digesting us. I looked for the maintenance crew. The log said a team of 3 had been down here for 2 days, fixing a valve pressure issue. I didn't see them. I called out, my voice sounding flat and dead in the damp air. No answer. Then I saw it. A standard issue Imperial boot protruding from a cluster of the white mass near the floor. Just the boot. And inside it, where the leg should have been, the white fibers had woven themselves tight, replacing the bone, replacing the meat. There was no blood. The plant had been efficient. It had used everything. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dropped the wrench. It clattered loud and sharp, and the mass reacted. The pale roots twitched. The amber sap began to flow faster, dripping with a renewed urgency. The walls groaned. It wasn't the metal settling. It was the sound of the station's foundation giving way inch by inch. We weren't living in a fortress. We were living in a meal that was being slowly chewed. I turned to run. I had to tell the command. I had to tell them the floor was a lie. I scrambled back down the corridor, slipping on the slime my hands, leaving streaks in the bioluminescent muck on the walls. I reached the lift and slammed my fist into the call button. I could hear a sound behind me, a wet, slithering like wet leather dragging over concrete. The roots were following the vibration. They were hunting. The lift doors hissed open, and I threw myself inside, jamming the ascent key. As the doors closed, I saw the darkness of the corridor shift. The shadows detached themselves from the ceiling and dropped to the floor. They weren't shadows. They were things with too many legs. The doors sealed just as a heavy thud shook the metal. I slumped against the wall, gasping for air that tasted of spores. And then the silence of the lift was shattered. Not by the hum of the fans, but by the screaming of sirens. Red flashing light flooded the small cabin. The general alarm. The harvest was over. The war had started. The lift doors opened, and the world had ended. Or at least the world we knew. The central assembly yard was a sea of yellow hazard suits and terrified faces. But the first thing that hit me wasn't the panic, it was the sky. The eternal gray cloud layer of Xylos Prime had turned a bruised, violent purple. It looked like a hematoma spreading across the heavens. And the noise, the sirens were screaming, but they sounded wrong. They sounded wet. I looked up at the Vox casters mounted on the perimeter poles. They were dripping. Thick, translucent resin had clogged the horns, turning the sharp wail of the alarm into a gurgling, drowning choke. It was the sound of authority being strangled. I was shoved forward by the crush of bodies. Thousands of workers the entire shift, funneling into the open courtyard. We were looking for orders. We were looking for the Space Marines, or the commissars, to tell us everything was under control. Instead, we got the rain. It started as a soft patter, then a roar. But it wasn't water. It was needles. Thorns long as a forearm and hard as iron falling from the purple clouds. They punched through the corrugated roofs of the hab blocks. They punched through the soft ballistic weave of the worker suits. A man next to me fell without a sound, a black spike driven clean through his shoulder, pinning him to the muddy ground. He didn't scream immediately. He just stared at the thing vibrating in his flesh, watching a green shoot instantly begin to unfurl from the wound. Then the walls were breached, not by artillery, but by speed. We watched in paralyzed horror as the jungle scaled the 50-meter ferrocrete barriers. It happened fast, too fast for biology. Vines surged over the parapets like a green tsunami, moving with the jerky, erratic speed of insect legs. They weren't growing, they were charging. The automated turrets swiveled their machine spirits confused. They fired into the mass explosive bolts, tearing chunks out of the vegetation. But for every vine they severed, 3 more whipped out to snare the gun barrels. I saw a heavy bolter crushed, twisted into scrap metal by a constrictor vine as thick as a main sewer line. The jungle didn't care about our firepower. It just swallowed it. "You logger." A hand grabbed my collar, nearly lifting me off my feet. It was a PDF sergeant, his face masked by a rebreather, his eyes wide with a frantic, chem-fueled intensity. He didn't ask for my ID. He looked at the calluses on my hands and the hydraulic fluid stains on my suit. "You know, pressure valves. You know, fuel mixture." I nodded, unable to speak. He shoved a heavy blackened canister into my arms and kicked a crate open at my feet. Inside was a flamer unit, heavy industrial grade. "Put it on. If it's green, you burn it. If it moves, you burn it." Just like that, I wasn't a worker anymore. I was meat for the grinder. I strapped the tank to my back. It was heavy, hurting my spine, but the weight felt grounding. It felt like a promise. The order came over the Vox, distorted and static-filled. "Seal the outer gates." I froze. The outer gates were massive adamantium slabs, but half the harvest crew was still out there, caught in the buffer zone trying to outrun the green tide. We could see them through the main archway, running, stumbling, waving their arms. I saw the massive gears of the gate mechanism begin to turn. The ground shook as the doors began to slide shut. The people outside screamed. They weren't screaming at the forest anymore. They were screaming at us. I stood there, the pilot light of my flamer sputtering a weak blue. I watched the gap narrow. I saw a woman I knew, a loader from Sector 7, trip and fall just meters from the threshold. She reached out. The gate slammed shut with a finality that vibrated in my teeth. The screaming cut off, instantly replaced by the dull thud of fists pounding on the other side. Dozens of fists. Then one by one, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wet gurgle of the dying sirens. The sergeant walked past me, checking his weapon. He didn't look at the gate. "Check your fuel levels," he said. "We're on our own." I looked at the nozzle in my hands. I clicked the igniter. A roar of fire burst forth, bright and orange and pure. It was the cleanest thing I had seen all day. We were ordered out. That was the grim joke of it all. We had just sealed the gates to keep the world out, and now, 3 hours later, the side hatches hissed open. A column of 200 men conscripts and PDF regulars marching into the soup. The objective was simple: establish a fire break. Burn a ring of scorched earth 2 kilometers wide around the station walls. If nothing grows, nothing gets in. That was the theory, but theories don't account for the smell. The moment I stepped onto the jungle floor, the air filters in my mask clogged. It smelled of musk and fermentation, a thick biological soup that coated your throat even through the rebreather. The mud was the first enemy. It wasn't just dirt and water. It was alive. It sucked at our boots with a greedy rhythmic pulse, like walking on the tongue of a giant beast. Every step was a battle. Squelch. Suck. Drag. My clean suit, the one I had meticulously scrubbed just hours ago, was coated in gray-green slime within minutes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the suit off and scrub my skin until it bled, but I gripped the heavy flamer in my hands instead. The pilot light was a tiny blue star in the gloom. It was the only clean thing left in the universe. I focused on it. I let the heat of the nozzle burn away the panic rising in my chest. The jungle was loud. Back in the station, the noise was mechanical, predictable. Here, it was a chaotic wall of sound. 1 billion insects were chittering in the canopy, a sound like dry rice pouring onto metal, endless and grating. It burrowed into your ears. "Keep moving," the sergeant barked over the Vox bead. Eyes front. "Don't look at the trees." That was a strange order. Don't look at the trees. But soon I understood. I was walking point, sweeping the flamer nozzle back and forth when I felt it. A pressure, a sense of being watched. I glanced to my left at a massive, twisting vine tree. It was motionless. I looked away. Then I heard the sound of wood grinding on wood. I looked back. The tree was 2 meters closer. It hadn't walked. It had shifted, like a statue moving in the dark. I said, "Don't look at them." The sergeant's voice cracked in my ear. "They wait for you to focus. Just burn the undergrowth." I obeyed. I pulled the trigger. The promethium roared, a stream of liquid fire that painted the world orange. The vegetation didn't just burn, it shrieked. As the flames licked the ferns, they writhed in agony, curling up like burning hair. It felt good. It felt right. I was purifying the path. I was the surgeon, and this was the cauterization. But for every meter we burned, the jungle seemed to press in tighter, the shadows lengthening, the chittering growing louder and more aggressive. Then the itching started. It began at my ankles, a sharp prickling sensation inside the sealed environment of my suit. Then it moved to my knees. Then my groin. "Sarge," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Something's inside." The Vox clicked. "Don't scratch," the sergeant replied, his voice dead flat. "You break the skin, the spores enter the bloodstream. You scratch, you die. Keep walking." I marched on, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. I could feel them, tiny things no bigger than mites, crawling over my sweat-slicked skin. They were looking for a pore, a cut, an opening. I clenched my teeth so hard I thought they would shatter. I imagined the fire. I imagined the fire inside the suit, burning them away. We lost Miller first. He was walking right beside me. He didn't scream, he just stopped. I turned to look. He was staring at his arm. A small tear in his suit, probably from a thorn. He had taken his glove off to scratch. His hand wasn't a hand anymore. It was a bloomed flower of red meat and white fibrous roots. The roots were moving visibly under the skin of his forearm, racing up toward his elbow, toward his heart. He looked at me, his eyes wide and childlike. "It feels cool," he whispered. "It takes the heat away." He raised the mutated limb toward me. "Burn him," the sergeant said. "No hesitation, no pity, just a work order. Burn him, Kalen, before it spores." Miller didn't beg. He just looked at the flamer. He knew. We all knew. This wasn't murder. It was sanitation. I raised the nozzle. I didn't think about his wife back in the Hab block. I didn't think about the card games we played. I thought about the roots moving under his skin. I thought about them touching me. I squeezed the trigger. The roar was deafening. Miller vanished inside a cone of white heat. He didn't scream. The fire was louder than his voice. When I stopped, there was only a charred statue of carbon and ash. The sergeant clapped my shoulder hard. "Good. Keep moving." We reached the marker for the perimeter edge. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows through the trees. We were exhausted, our fuel tanks half empty. I leaned against a massive trunk to catch my breath, the heat of the heavy metal tank searing my back. I looked up at the tree I was leaning on. The bark was pale, smooth, almost like skin. And then I saw the pattern in the wood. About 7 feet up, the bark knotted and twisted. It formed a shape, a nose, a mouth frozen in a silent scream, eyes that were just knots in the wood, but somehow still terrified. It was the face of Corporal Vance, who had gone missing on patrol 2 days ago. He wasn't dead. He was integrated. The tree had drunk him. I stared at the face. I didn't scream. I just checked my fuel gauge. I had enough left. I raised the nozzle. The silence stayed. We built our fortress out of the dead. 3 days in, and the perimeter was just a circle of wrecked Chimera transports and overturned supply trucks pushed together in the mud. We huddled underneath the rusted chassis, seeking shelter from the incessant rain. The metal of the hulls was pitting and corroding before our eyes, turning from military gray to a sickly oxidized orange. The air inside our makeshift bunker didn't smell like soldiers anymore. It smelled of ozone. Sharp electric and burnt. It was the smell of the machine spirit dying. The humidity here wasn't just water, it was an acid bath for circuitry. Every breath tasted like licking a battery. I watched Private Jensen try to clean his laser gun. He was frantic, his movements jerky and terrified. He stripped the weapon down, wiping the focusing lenses with a rag that was already damp with mildew. "It won't fire," he whispered more to the gun than to me. "It won't focus." I looked out into the darkness. The jungle had deployed a new weapon, the mist. It wasn't normal fog. It was a suspension of prismatic crystals hanging heavy in the air. When the guards fired their las rifles, the beams didn't cut through the dark. They hit the mist and shattered, refracting into harmless showers of disco light. The planet had learned physics. It had learned how to neutralize directed energy. The heavy weapons teams fared no better. The bolters, the holy instruments of the Astartes that we revered, were turning into clubs. The explosive reactive shells were coated in a fine, fuzzy mold that had eaten through the wax seals in the ammunition crates. When the trigger was pulled, you didn't hear the roar of the Emperor's fury. You heard a dull, wet click. Then the sound of a man cursing as he racked the slide trying to clear a jam that went down to the molecular level. The explosive compounds had been neutralized, turned into inert paste by the fungal spores. We were the most advanced army in the galaxy, reduced to shivering apes holding metal sticks. I sat in the corner near the heat of the Prometheum reservoir. My flamer was heavy, crude, and ugly. It didn't have optical lenses to fog up. It didn't have complex firing mechanisms to jam with moss. It was just a pump and a spark. I ran my gloved hand over the fuel tank. It was warm. It vibrated slightly like a purring cat. The others looked at their jammed rifles with despair. I looked at my flamer with love. This was the only truth left. Fire doesn't malfunction. Fire doesn't care about spores or prisms. Fire is the only thing this world understands. I started to hum a low, tuneless sound, matching the vibration of the tank. The cleanliness I sought wasn't in water anymore. It was in the flame. Then the Voxcaster died. It had been sputtering static for hours, a chorus of ghost voices and white noise. Then a sharp pop, and the smell of frying capacitors filled the small space. The operator ripped the headset off his ears, bleeding. "Gone," he said, staring at the dead console. "The frequencies. They're screaming." I looked at him. "My machine speaks," I said, quietly stroking the nozzle of the flamer. "It says, burn." He looked at me with fear, but he didn't argue. He knew I was the only one holding a working weapon. "Listen," someone whispered. The outpost fell silent. For 3 nights, the jungle had been throwing itself at us, waves of chitinous beetles, lashing vines, and things with too many teeth. But now, silence. The chittering had stopped. The scratching on the metal hulls had ceased. The radar screen, usually a mess of red contact dots, swept clear. The green wall had pulled back. They weren't retreating out of fear. You don't retreat when you're winning. They were making space. They were clearing the stage for something else. I tightened my grip on the trigger mechanism. The pilot light hissed, a small serpent of blue fire waiting to be unleashed. I didn't feel relief. I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of anticipation. The rain drummed on the roof of the Chimera. It sounded like fingers tapping on a coffin lid. The suns came up, but they didn't bring light. They just turned the black mist into a suffocating milk-white soup. Visibility dropped to 5 meters. You couldn't see the enemy, but you could feel them. The ground wasn't vibrating with footsteps. It was trembling with weight. Massive weight. We stood in the mud backs against the rusting tracks of the Chimeras, waiting. I checked the pressure valve on my tank. The needle jittered in the red zone. Good. High pressure meant a longer stream. High pressure meant safety. The men around me were shaking. I could hear their teeth clicking together, a frantic Morse code of terror. They were holding useless rifles, praying to a god emperor who was light years away. I just stroked the trigger mechanism. I was the only priest here now. They broke the line without a roar. There was just the screech of tearing metal, like a fork dragging across a dinner plate, magnified 1,000 times. The mist swirled and a shape emerged, a nightmare of chitin and muscle the size of a siege tank. It smashed into the barricade of wrecked vehicles, flipping a 3-ton truck as if it were a toy. It wasn't a Tyranid. It wasn't alien. It was native. It was a stag beetle evolved to crack mountains. Its shell was iridescent, shimmering with oil-slick colors. A heavy bolter team opened fire. The round sparked harmlessly off the carapace, ricocheting into the mud. The creature didn't even slow down. It swept a pincer forward, snapping the gunner in half. There was no blood mist, just a wet crunch and silence. "Fire, focus." "Fire," the sergeant screamed, but his voice was thin, swallowed by the fog. The last fire was pathetic. The beams hit the creature's shell and scattered, diffused by some biological coating that acted like a prism shield. The beast lunged, its mandibles dripping with a corrosive slime that hissed when it hit the ground. It was eating the squad. It was efficient, brutal, and unstoppable. I didn't feel fear. That part of my brain had burned out days ago. I felt clarity. I stepped forward past the cowering conscripts. I was the heavy logger. This was just another tree to clear. A very angry, moving tree. I depressed the trigger. The recoil shoved me back into the mud, but I planted my feet. The stream of promethium hit the creature dead center. For a second, nothing happened. Then the oil on its shell ignited. The fire didn't bounce. Fire sticks. The creature shrieked a sound that wasn't vocal, but the sound of boiling fluids whistling through spiracles. It thrashed, turning the mud into steam. I didn't let up. I held the trigger down, walking toward it. pouring the liquid hell into the joints of its armor. The heat was blistering. It singed my eyebrows through the mask. I was laughing. I realized I was laughing because I couldn't hear my own voice over the roar of the flame. It collapsed, twitching a burning heap of biological slag. I cut the feed. The sudden silence was heavy. I looked down at myself. I was covered in it. The black, boiling ichor of the beast had sprayed over my suit. Days ago, I would have screamed. I would have clawed my skin off to get clean. Now I just looked at the stain. It was sterile. The fire had boiled it clean. I looked at the sergeant. He was pale, staring at the burning carcass. "We drove them back," he whispered. I looked at the fog. The shapes were still there, moving in the white haze. They hadn't fled. They had just stepped back. They weren't retreating. They were hurting us. "No," I said, wiping the soot from my faceplate. "They just want us to move. They're steering us." We retreated. Or maybe we were funneled. We stumbled down into a ravine where the mist couldn't reach a deep scar in the earth filled with giant weeping mushrooms. The light here was wrong. It didn't come from the sky. It came from the ground. Every step we took kicked up clouds of phosphorescent dust, leaving glowing footprints that faded too slowly. The plants here pulsed. I swear to the throne they pulsed. Great bulbous flowers the size of drop pods swelled and contracted in a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of my own heart. It was hypnotic. It was sickening. We were walking through the insides of a living thing, and we were the foreign bodies. We found the tank in a clearing of blue moss. It was a Lehman Russ Vanquisher, the pride of the Imperial Guard, a 60-ton beast of adamantium and wrath. But it hadn't been destroyed. It hadn't been blown apart by rockets or crushed by a behemoth. It was being dismantled. The tank was suspended in the air, held aloft by thick cable-like vines that had grown out of the cliff face. They weren't crushing the hull. They were exploring it. I walked closer, my flamer pilot light casting long, dancing shadows. The engine block had been removed, not ripped out, but carefully extracted. Roots as fine as hair were woven into the spark plugs, tracing the fuel lines, sliding into the piston chambers. I touched the cold metal of the track links. They were unbolted. Neat piles of nuts and washers sat on a flat rock nearby, arranged by size. The planet wasn't just smashing us, it was studying us. It was taking apart our technology to see how it worked. I felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. Animals kill to eat, beasts kill to defend territory. But this was curiosity. This was intelligence. We weren't fighting a chaotic nature. We were fighting a mind. A slow, ancient geological mind that was dissecting our weapons to understand why they hurt. "Look at the turret," whispered the sergeant. His voice was trembling. I looked up. The main cannon was pointed at the entrance of the ravine. A massive vine had wrapped around the barrel, and smaller tendrils had wormed their way into the firing mechanism. It wasn't just holding the gun. It was aiming it. The planet had learned what a cannon was. It had learned that when the metal tube points, things die. I backed away, gripping my flamer. The machine spirit of the tank was gone, replaced by sap and wood. It was a trophy. No, not a trophy. A prototype. Then the Vox bead in my ear crackled. It had been dead for 20 hours. The sudden noise made me jump, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Command to Delta 9 elements," the voice said. It was clear, too clear. There was no static, no background noise of war. "Sector 4 is secure. Return to base. Warm food. Safe beds." I stared at the sergeant. He looked at me, his eyes wide. The voice, it didn't breathe. The cadence was perfect, but the tone was flat, like audio files spliced together. "Return to base," it repeated. "We are waiting." It wasn't the colonel. It sounded like the wind, blowing through a hollow log, shaping itself into words it had heard us say. The vox wasn't coming from a radio. It was coming from the trees. The sergeant reached for his transmit button, his hand shaking. I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I hissed. "Don't answer." He looked at the radio, then at the silent, watching forest. The voice spoke again, sweet and rotting. "Why do you not answer?" "We have fixed the air." I looked at the dismantled tank, then at the glowing flowers pulsing in time with my racing heart. The planet knew our frequencies. It knew our language. And now, it was trying to lure us home. "It's not them," I said, backing away into the shadows. "It's the garden." The silence returned, heavier than before. We found a cave to hide in. It was a throat of black rock that went deep into the cliffside, far away from the bioluminescent glare of the forest. We thought the rock would save us. We thought stone was dead, and therefore safe. We were wrong. The dampness was here too. It dripped from the stalactites, a thick, viscous slime that tasted of iron and sugar. We hadn't eaten in 2 days. The ration packs were sealed, vacuum-packed in thick plastic. But when we opened them, the nutrient bars were fuzzy. Green mold had grown inside the vacuum. The spores were small enough to pass through molecular seals. We stared at the food. Some men ate it anyway. They were weeping while they chewed, driven by a hunger that overrode their sanity. I didn't eat. I chewed on the collar of my envirosuit just to have something in my mouth. It was Harlan who broke first. He was the one I had sat with in the mess hall days ago or years ago, I couldn't tell anymore. He had been coughing for hours. Not a dry, hacking cough of a smoker, but a wet, tearing sound, like tearing wet paper. He was huddled in the corner, his helmet off. "It's warm," he whispered. I crawled over to him. The cave was freezing, but Harlan was sweating. His skin had taken on a translucent, waxy quality. I shined my torch on his face. Under the skin of his cheeks, I could see them. Fine, thread-like veins. But they weren't blue. They were bright, vibrant emerald. The circulation system of a plant was overriding his own. I can hear them. "Kalen," he said, smiling. His teeth were stained green. "They aren't angry. They just want to hold us." He coughed again, and this time he didn't spit up blood. He hacked up a clump of wet moss. It landed on the stone floor and immediately began to unfurl, rooting into the rock. I backed away, revulsion coiling in my gut like a cold snake. This was the ultimate violation. The dirt wasn't just on him, it was being him. "Don't look at me like that." He murmured, his eyes drifting. The whites of his eyes were gone, replaced by a swirling nebula of pollen. It hurts less this way. The machine hurts. The work hurts. This is soft. He started to strip off his armor. He tore at the flak vest, snapping the straps with a strength a dying man shouldn't have. He wanted his skin to touch the damp floor. Patches of his chest were already bark-like, rough and brown. "Join us," he whispered. "It's so lonely being human." He reached out a hand. His fingers were fusing together, the nails elongating into wooden claws. He wasn't Harlan anymore. He was a seedling, a traitor to his own biology. He was everything I hated. He was dirt. He was disorder. He was the rot. "I can't," I said. My voice was hollow. I stood up, the servo motors in my legs whining in the quiet cave. I primed the flamer. The pilot light hissed a sound of judgment. Harlan didn't scream. He didn't beg for his life. He looked at the nozzle and smiled, a look of genuine pity on his wooden face. "You're so cold," he said. "You're all dead inside and you don't even know it." I pulled the trigger. I didn't use a long burst, just a short, controlled pulse, enough to carbonize the infection. The fire washed over him. He didn't thrash. He just burned like dry kindling. The smell wasn't like burning meat. It smelled like a campfire in autumn. It smelled nostalgic. I sat in the dark for a long time after the fire died down. The others were asleep or dead or changing. I didn't check. I sat with my back against the cold stone, shivering. I felt an itch, a tiny, insignificant itch in the corner of my left eye. I ignored it. I told myself it was ash. I told myself it was fatigue. But my hand moved on its own. I pulled a polished shard of metal from my belt, a piece of the destroyed tank. I held it up to the dying light of the embers. I looked at my reflection. My face was gaunt, smeared with soot and oil. But my eye, deep in the iris, buried in the brown, there was a speck, a tiny glowing dot of green. It wasn't a reflection, it was a spore. It had taken root. I lowered the mirror. I didn't scream, I just started cleaning my gun, again and again. We walked back to Delta 9 because there was nowhere else to go. We were moths circling a dead bulb. The jungle let us pass. The vines retracted, the thorns pulled back into the stems. It wasn't mercy. It was the indifference of a victor. The station loomed out of the mist, its ferrocrete walls towering 50 meters high, scarred but standing. From a distance, it looked like salvation. The hazard lights were still spinning amber. The turrets were still tracking. But there was no smoke from the chimneys. There was no vibration in the ground. The hum, the constant comforting thrum of the ventilation was gone. The silence of the station was louder than the screaming of the forest. We entered through the maintenance breach I had fled from days ago. The blast doors were open. Not forced open, but stuck. The hydraulic rams were rusted solid, frozen in place by a sudden accelerated oxidation. We stepped into the main concourse. I expected bodies. I expected signs of a last stand. Laser gun burns on the walls. Barricades of furniture, spent shell casings littering the floor. There was nothing. The floor was pristine, save for a thin layer of gray dust. The corridors were empty. The silence pressed against my eardrums, heavy and suffocating. It felt like walking into a tomb that had been sealed for 1,000 years. Not a barracks that was alive 3 days ago. We found them in the habitation spire. All of them. They were in their bunks or sitting at the mess tables. There was no blood. There were no signs of panic. They had simply stopped. The air scrubbers, the great lungs of the station, had failed. The filters hadn't just clogged, they had bloomed. A black velvety mold had grown inside the ventilation shafts, pumping millions of tons of asphyxiating spores into the sleeping quarters. They had died in their sleep, choking on dreams of home. I walked past a table where a game of regicide was set up. The players were slumped over the board. A fine layer of gray moss covered their uniforms, linking them to the table, to the floor, to the station. They were part of the architecture now. I felt nothing. That was the most terrifying part. I looked at the corpse of the quartermaster, a man I had argued with over boot polish a week ago, and I felt absolutely hollow. The panic, the fear of dirt, the obsession with cleanliness, it had all evaporated. What was the point of washing your hands when the air itself was a poison? I walked through the grave of my old life. I touched the wall. It was cold and slimy. I didn't wipe my hand. I just stared at the residue on my glove. I was walking through the gut of a dead machine. I was the only moving part left. We reached the command center. The blast shutters were down. The emergency lights bathed the room in a blood-red wash. The Vox officer was slumped over his console, the headset fused to his skull by fungal growth. But the console was alive. A green light blinked on the dashboard. A repeating signal. I leaned in, pushing the corpse aside gently. The screen displayed a countdown. It was a transmission from high orbit. Imperial Navy Flotilla, Hammer of Dorn, arriving. Purge protocols initiated. T-minus 4 hours. It wasn't a rescue beacon. It was an execution order. The Navy wasn't coming to save the station. They were coming to burn the mistake. I looked at the countdown. 03:59 to 12. I laughed. It was a dry, dusty sound. We had survived the jungle just to be killed by our own gods. We climbed. We ascended the spine of the communication tower, the metal grating clanging under our boots. It was the highest point in the sector, a spire of steel piercing the low, heavy clouds. Below us, the station was gone. It wasn't just occupied, it was erased. The gray ferrocrete had vanished under a carpet of writhing green. From this height, you could see the true scale of the enemy. It wasn't a forest, it was an ocean, and the tide was coming in. A wave of biomass vines, beasts' thorns, was scaling the tower, rising like floodwater. They were coming for the last heat signatures. They were coming to snuff out the last sparks. I reached the maintenance deck at the summit. The wind here was ferocious, whipping the black mist into swirling devils. There were 5 of us left, 5 ghosts in battered armor. We didn't speak. We didn't check our ammo. We knew what we had. The sergeant pointed to the beacon light, a rotating amber bulb that cut through the gloom. "Hold the line," he yelled over the wind. "Keep it lit for the Navy. Let them see where to aim." It was a suicide order. We were guarding a target painted on our own heads. But I didn't care about the Navy. I looked at the main fuel coupling for the tower's backup generators. A thick yellow pipe pulsing with high-grade promethium. The first wave hit the deck edge. They poured over the railing, sleek black hunters, with too many eyes and scythes for limbs. The remaining lasguns cracked a pathetic strobe light against the dark. The beasts didn't stop. They tore through Private Vaughn, ripping him apart with the efficiency of shucking corn. I didn't shoot. I dropped my empty tank. I dragged the generator fuel line over, severed the coupling with my combat knife, and jammed the hose directly into the intake of my flamer unit. It was reckless. It was insane. It bypassed every safety regulator in the weapon. I didn't care. I wanted the pressure. I squeezed the trigger. There was no recoil this time. There was just thrust. A jet of white-hot liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, a solid beam of destruction 50 meters long. It didn't look like fire. It looked like a lightsaber. I swept the deck. The noise was apocalyptic. The roar of the burning fuel drowned out the wind, the screams, the chittering. Everything I touched vanished. The beasts didn't burn. They evaporated. The metal railing melted, dripping like wax into the abyss below. I was screaming. I think I was screaming. My throat was raw, but I couldn't hear myself. I felt the heat blistering the skin on my chest through the ceramite plate. It felt like a hug, a burning, purifying hug. "Come on," I roared into the inferno. "Take it. Take it all." I was laughing now, a manic, jagged sound. I spun in a circle, creating a vortex of fire. I was the sun. I was the center of the universe. For a moment, the jungle hesitated. The vines recoiled. The beasts shrieked and fell back. They understood this. They understood physics. They understood that I was more dangerous than they were. I wasn't just killing them, I was unmaking them. I felt powerful. I felt clean. For the first time in my life, I was absolutely perfectly sterile. Then the hose ran dry. The pressure dropped. The white beam sputtered into a pathetic orange cough. Then nothing. The silence slammed back into place, deafening and heavy. I stood there, panting smoke rising from my armor. The barrel of the flamer was glowing cherry red, warping in the cold air. I looked down. My boots were fused to the deck. My hands were blistered inside my gloves. The deck was clear of enemies, just a circle of black ash and molten slag. But below the edge, I could hear them. Scrabbling. Climbing. Returning. I looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting. Not from the wind, but from the pressure of massive engines. They were here. The sky tore open. It wasn't a metaphor. The thick, bruise-colored cloud layer that had suffocated us for weeks was physically pushed aside by the prow of a Gothic-class cruiser. It hung there, a city of gold, and adamant, floating in the void, haloed by the re-entry fire. It was beautiful. It was the most majestic thing I had ever seen. The sheer displacement of air created a thunderclap that shook the tower down to its foundations. The sergeant fell to his knees, weeping openly. He waved his arms, shouting into the wind, "Here we are here. Praise the throne. They found us." He fired a flare, a tiny red spark against the backdrop of a god machine. I watched the flare rise. It looked so pathetic. It burned for a second and died against the massive, uncaring hull of the ship. The ship didn't move. It didn't bank. It didn't launch Valkyrie gunships or drop pods. It simply sat there, blocking out the suns, casting a shadow that swallowed the entire station. I waited for the Vox to crackle. I waited for the order to prepare for extraction. I waited for the angels to descend, but the only sound was the atmospheric stabilizers of the cruiser, a low tectonic groaning that vibrated in my chest. Then I saw the bays open, not the hangar bays, the bombardment bays. Rows of black maws along the ship's keel unhinged, revealing the dark emptiness of space inside. I saw the warheads racking into position. They were the size of hab blocks. They weren't designed to kill an enemy. They were designed to kill a biosphere. The sergeant stopped shouting. He lowered his arms slowly, his face crumpling from ecstasy into a hollow, shattering realization. He saw it too. The lie of the Imperium stripped bare in one moment. We weren't the defenders of humanity. We were just the bait. We were the petri dish, and they were the incinerator. "They aren't landing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They aren't landing." I walked to the edge of the railing. I looked down at the jungle that was clawing its way up the spire, hungry and alive. Then I looked up at the golden ship, cold and distant. They were the same. Both of them were monsters. One wanted to eat us. The other wanted to erase us. I didn't feel angry. Rage requires energy, and I had burned all mine. I felt clear. It made sense. Why waste a shuttle? Why risk a pilot for 5 broken men infected with spores, a debit on a ledger in the administratum? Asset Delta 9. Status compromised. Solution purge. It was efficient. It was clean. It was exactly what I would have done. I leaned against the hot railing of the tower. I reached up and undid the latches of my helmet. The seals hissed a sound of surrender. I pulled it off and let it drop. It clattered on the deck and rolled off the edge, falling into the green abyss. The air hit my face. It was cold, damp, and tasted of ozone and death. I took a deep breath. It burned my lungs, but it was my breath, not recycled, not filtered. "Come on then," I whispered to the sky. "Make it clean." I took a breath. A real breath. The air didn't taste like poison anymore. It tasted like wet earth, like crushed flowers, like the iron tang of blood. It was heavy and humid, filling my lungs with a weight that should have been suffocating, but instead felt like an anchor. I felt the change immediately. It wasn't a sickness, it was a greeting. Deep inside my chest, where the alveoli met the bloodstream, I felt the millions of microscopic roots, unfolding, piercing the tissue, weaving themselves into the fabric of my being. It didn't hurt. It felt like a lock clicking into place. The shaking in my hand stopped. The fear that had driven me for weeks, the terror of the dirt, the obsession with the clean, it all vanished. I wasn't fighting the planet anymore. I was finally answering it. The sky turned white. It started at the horizon, a blinding, silent line of pure incandescence where the first warheads made contact. The clouds evaporated instantly. The jungle below, that screaming, churning ocean of green, went quiet. It knew. The entire biosphere tensed, a collective intake of breath before the blow. The sergeant was on his knees, screaming a prayer to the god emperor, clutching his rosarius, so hard the metal cut his palm. I didn't pray. I didn't look away. I watched the wall of fire race toward us. It was faster than sound. It stripped the forest from the bedrock, turning trees into ash and ash into glass in a fraction of a second. It was the ultimate sterilization, the cleanliness I had always wanted. As the light hit the tower, time seemed to stretch. The metal railing under my hand didn't melt. It simply ceased to exist. I saw the skin of my hand turn black, then flake away like burnt paper. But beneath the char, there was no bone. There was emerald, a lattice of glowing green crystal where my skeleton used to be. The fire washed over me a tidal wave of heat that should have erased my consciousness. But I was still there. I wasn't Kalen the logger. I wasn't a soldier. I was a seed. The pain was distant, a dull roar on the other side of a thick wall. I felt the roots in my lungs expand, connecting me to the ground, to the deep aquifers, to the burning heart of the world. I heard the planet scream, not in pain, but in defiance. Then there was nothing. The noise was so loud it canceled itself out, leaving a ringing silence that stretched for eternity. The tower was gone. The station was gone. The jungle was a flat, smoking plain of obsidian glass. The hammer of Dorn hung in the sky, a golden idol satisfied with its sacrifice. I drifted. I was smoke. I was vapor. I was a memory etched into the scorched rock. The fleet began to turn their engines flaring blue as they prepared to break orbit. They believed they had won. They believed that fire kills everything. They were so arrogant. They didn't understand that fire is just another part of the cycle. Ash is just fertilizer. High above on the cold adamantium hull of the cruiser, in a microscopic crevice near the engine exhaust, a single spore clung. It had ridden the thermal updrafts, carried by the very explosion meant to destroy it. It was encased in a shell of diamond-hard chitin, impervious to the void, waiting for warmth, waiting for a new world. And down in the ruin, deep beneath the glass crust of the planet, in the cool dark, where the fires couldn't reach a pulse beat. Slow, steady. Thump, thump. I closed my eyes. The war would continue. It always did. But for now, the garden would sleep. I listened to the silence, and I was free.